we have a lot of people in a lot of different places relative to committee meetings this afternoon. I know several members of this committee have two meetings besides this one going on. I am on call to Ways and Means to present legislation myself. So we're going to go ahead and get started with this. The attention of the chair this afternoon. Gentlemen, don't let our conversation get in your way, if you would. We will go ahead and get started this afternoon. We don't intend to take a vote on the matters. We'll have a first hearing on them, give the authors chances to meet with anyone that speaks and try to move forward. It is also my intention to move our meeting next week from Wednesday to Tuesday, since we seem to be bumping into a lot of folks on Tuesday with that day off. So with that, we have two items on the agenda. We have Representative Clark's measure. Is that 669, Representative? We have 669, and we'll have a brief hearing when the Vice Chair of the committee's here. Chairman Chuck, if he arrives, we'll have a brief hearing on 920, a measure that I am joined with Bruce Williamson and Edward Lindsay in. So I'd also like to invite anyone that would like to speak to the measures, if you would let us know after the author presents the bill and the committee asks questions, we'll take comment and conversation on the measures. With that, Representative Clark, if you're ready, we'll entertain your presentation on House Bill 669. What we have in our folder is LC 334303. Is that the document you're presenting from? Wherever you're comfortable, sir. Feel free to be seated if that's if that makes you more comfortable. If you'd like to stand.
Yes, sir. We have it's LC 334303. And Mr. Chairman, I thank you for allowing me to come and present before you and the honorable members of this committee. It's an honor and privilege to be here today. This bill that I present, HB 669, is the Federal Receipts Reporting Bill. It's a simple two-page bill, or I guess you might say, or maybe a three-page, depending on how you want to count it. Anyway, this bill would require state agencies to develop contingency plans based on 5% and 25% cuts to the federal budget. It also would require that each agency report the following: the aggregate amount of federal funds they received for the previous fiscal year, the aggregate amount of federal funds that were appropriated by the legislature to them, and the percentage of their budget that was comprised of federal funds. So next question, probably why this bill? Well, as we all know, the federal deficit is spiraling out of control. I don't need to tell you all that. Do you know that? $15 trillion and rapidly growing. National debt exceeds now 100% of GDP. Last year we heard constantly in the news about the federal proposed budget cuts and super committees and the failure of those committees, and because of the failure of the committee to come to a consensus on reducing our federal deficit, it automatically went into effect a 9% across the board budget cut. So this bill is an attempt to be proactive and being responsible to citizens of this state to make sure that we're aware of how much of the funds from the state agencies are coming from federal funds, and that we're beginning an exercise of preparing contingency plans in case, and I guess not so much if, but when these budget cuts would come down the road. I would point out that Utah passed this bill last year. Pretty much the very same bill, and the Moody Credit Rating Agency credited, really bragged on their proactive measure through this bill in helping to maintain their AAA bond rating. This bill has since been adopted as ALEC model legislation, and over a dozen states are dropping that as well this year. So there's kind of a concerted effort as we're all concerned about the federal deficit and how states are going to respond to that. Just last week, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke said that These unsustained deficits has cost, including an increased possibility of sudden physical crisis. So just kind of going back to not when, but not if, but when these federal cuts will come down to us. I have spoken with Martha Wigden, director of the House Budget Office, and she said that she thought this, in her opinion, would be would not be a difficult a task for them to compile. That would be relatively simple. Although, as John Brown, the former director of the House of the Budget Office, he's also a constituent of mine, and talking to him about it, he said that he thought it would be difficult. We could get to it. It would be difficult for us to get to that information, whereas they could compile that easily so that it could easily be available to us. And when I say us, this bill calls for them to present each agency to report again under if you're reading the bill under B 1, 2, and 3. Again, report the aggregate amount of federal receipts, the percentage of those receipts that are made up of the percentage of the dollars that come from the federal dollars that make up the budget, and the percentage that we appropriated to the amount that we appropriated to them, and they would then submit that to the budget. Would present that to the Department of Audits and Accounts on or before November 30th, and then lastly, the Department of Audit and Accounts would then submit that to appropriations so that it would be brought up in the first committee meeting of appropriations. The last thing that I should mention that this bill would do would call for a study committee that would meet over the interim and the House and Senate joint study on whether or not we should ask for higher education and K-12 to prepare contingency plans in their report. So this bill does not require them to do that, but it does create a study committee. And with that, I will accept any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Representatives, members of the committee have questions. The author of the legislation. Questions? Sure. You're on.
Okay. Well, thank you, Representative Clark. I appreciate your calling focus to this attention. Just some general thoughts and questions. You've enumerated all these state agencies that would be defined under this code section. Are any missing?
No, sir, not to my knowledge.
Okay. Having served on the board of the Department of Community Affairs, that one kind of jumps out at me, and I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but that an enormous amount of the revenues coming into this Department of Community Affairs are in fact federal dollars, and it subsequently serves as a pass-through agency for federal programs such as the Section 8 housing voucher program, which if the thing was slashed in half, it wouldn't really affect the services, or it wouldn't put any additional pressure on the state of Georgia's budget. Those federal dollars just wouldn't show up in housing vouchers throughout the state of Georgia. That's probably the single biggest pass-through that I can think of, and it's about 16,000 Georgia families that are being served through that program. But my point is, just because federal dollars are showing up doesn't mean that the taxpayers, if it stopped dead in its tracks, it wouldn't mean that the taxpayers would take a hit because of the funds not coming into that agency. There might be economic reverberations because of it, but not because of the fact there wouldn't be any additional pressure on the state of Georgia's budget. I just didn't know whether or not there'd been any consideration or thoughts on similar situations through any of the other agencies. But overall, I don't want that to sound negative, because I very much applaud the fact that we have to be diligent in keeping our financial affairs in order to continue to enjoy our AAA bond rating that we've always had here in the state. The other question I had, that's just an observation more than a question. On the sort of the oversight council, tell me about that. How that be structured again?
The last part of
Right.
that I alluded to, that would just be proposes a committee to study whether or not to draft and propose further legislation that would require the city and counties, as well as state institutions of higher education, to submit contingency plans based on possibility of future cuts to their federal dollars to their budget.
And I guess I'm just curious as to why it would be the Governmental Affairs Committee rather than this particular committee.
Say that again.
It says line 77, during the 2012 interim, the Senate Government Oversight Committee and the House Committee on Governmental Affairs shall jointly study whether to draft and propose legislation. So,
you're saying why that committee?
Mm-hmm.
You know what? I don't have a strong argument for that. It seemed to be the just personally, it seemed to be the committee that, in talking with Legis Council, that seemed to be the committee that perhaps would be the best to oversee that. But I'm certainly open to any suggestions. Thank you, Representative Williamson.
Clearly, Representative Williams is looking for something to do over the summer.
I'm
on both committees.
Okay, well, you would get it either way. Yes, sir.
Trying to drag you into it.
Chairman Howson.
I had a friendly question regarding the study committee. Have you talked with anyone to see how many study committees are possibly going to be funded? I would hate for your bill to not go into effect because it had this study committee in there. For a couple of years ago, we weren't having very many study committees. Has that changed, or have you talked with anybody in the Speaker's office about the number of study committees they plan on having this year? Or
I have not.
because for a while they were limiting the number of study committees because the budget was so tight, and I would hate for this to hold you up, having the study committee in here to hold your bill up.
Yeah, Representative, I appreciate you pointing that out. Yeah, I would not want this to hold the bill up. I agree with you. I did speak with the Speaker's office about this bill and sat down with them and went over it. But I didn't ask them how many study committees that they have, and we didn't really spend much time discussing how this might fit into the number that they've proposed for this coming year. I did speak with also along with meeting with the Speaker's office, also with Larry O'Neill and others about this, and they were encouraging of this bill, but I don't have anything directly to.
Yeah, well, you might want to, while it's sort of been developed and everything, you might want to see how many study committees that they're planning on having, because I don't know if things have changed.
That's an excellent
point. They
point.
were limiting the number of study committees.
I will do that. Thank you. Make a note of that right now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Representative Clark, thank you very much for bringing this bill. I also applaud the intent of this bill, because we do need to look and see how cuts from the federal government will affect us. Mr. Chairman, I apologize for coming in a little bit late. I assume that we're just looking at this bill today, not voting on it?
We are trying to look at this bill today. Yeah, we are not trying to limit the gentleman's ability to pass the legislation. We can meet again later this week, or at the latest next Tuesday, in order to move him along. I just think it gives people an opportunity to hear about it today. Perhaps there's someone in the audience that would like to comment on it, make it, perfect the legislation, and give them an opportunity to get with the author of the legislation. There may be no changes. There may you may have drafted the thing that we all seek, the perfect piece of legislation, Representative. But if not, we'll give you an opportunity to do that and bring it back.
And well, I certainly share Representative Williamson's concerns about it coming back to the committee. Probably this committee would be the best committee suited to do that. And for the study committee, I don't know if you need entire committees from the House and the Senate, but maybe you might want to present in here a little overall composition. You may want somebody from appropriations, et cetera, to serve on that study committee. So I might see that could be something that could be worked on, and getting exactly who would be on that study committee on there, and limiting it again to those people, and limiting it to people without any pay other than per diem at the most.
If I may, Representative, and I'm reading this, you refer to it as a study committee, but in reality what you're looking at is line 77 through 79, where you're really seeking the two standing committees to study, correct?
Yes.
So you're not talking about in terms of, as we have in the past, pick 3 members of the House, 3 members of the Senate, and created another ad hoc study committee with limited per diem. You would just seek to either these two committees or 2 other committees if you have discussion and change that, but you would just ask the chairs of those respective committees to assign a member or members of that committee to do this work, not to create another committee per se. Is that correct?
Yes, Chairman, I appreciate you you pointing that out. That is correct. Thank you for clarifying that. It would not. You're right. It would not be a new study committee, but rather a study group. Thank you.
Does the committee have any further questions of the author of the measure? We have LC 334303. Any further questions? Is there anyone in the audience who would like to speak to this measure? Harken back, please come ahead. Harken back to the old days. You don't have to feel like you're speaking in support of or opposition to. If you just would wish to talk to the measure, we have House Bill 669. If you would come and tell the committee members who you are.
Yes, sir. I certainly don't, not talking against the bill or anything. My name is Russell Hinton. I'm the state auditor. And as such, I'm head of the Department of Audits and Accounts. My one concern that I do have is that the timing of the measure calls for us to capture all the information from the agencies by November the 1st, and then compile it and present it in a report to the legislature by December the 1st. Yes, my main concern is our office is charged with the responsibility of auditing the financial statements of the state. We have to have the state's comprehensive annual financial report audited by December the 31st. We have to perform the state's single audit. It has to be issued by mid-February. That's our federal review of all the state's federal expenditures. Our being able to audit that and get it out by December the 31st is critical to us maintaining our AAA rating, and we've made hard strides to come within those limits. As Representative Williamson stated, he being on the board of Department of Community Health, I'm sorry. Well, I know that Community Health has quite. Yeah, I didn't mean to spread that to you there, but they have a critical time getting their audit to us by the end of December. But that would be my major concern, is to the compilation of this larger report sort of right in the wheelhouse of what when we're trying to finish auditing the state, and that would be my concern. One other instance that I am aware of is that the Office of Planning and Budget last year sent out instructions to all the agencies to provide information similar to this to the Office of Planning and Budget. And it also called for contingencies for reductions. I believe in their instructions it was 15% and 30%. And I can appreciate Representative Clark's want to institutionalize this process, because certainly with upcoming federal federal budget reductions. We certainly anticipate them. The state is going to have to do some very good planning to meet those challenges, and I know this sounds trite, but my main concern is about us being able to produce such a large report and still meet our deadlines for continuing an audit. So if this cup could be passed to another group, we'd be totally enjoying in support of it. But,
it sounds like Representative Williamson was looking for something to do in the summer. Perhaps we can get him. No, I seriously, I hear you, and that's the very reason that I wanted to have the gentleman present his measure, because I think, speaking from my personal opinion, representing House District in Georgia, I think it's a good idea. And I understand your worries with the dates. And what I would say, or what I would ask you to do, is this: can you get with him and talk about the dates, but also, if it please the committee members, talk about function over form in the report. In other words, if in the beginning of this, to me, it doesn't need to be a glossy, fine, multiple index sort of thing. It's just, it may be something that evolves over time. It says the report and how it's put together, but if perhaps you could help,
I would be glad to
define that in the next, over the next week or so. I'd like to get this
yes, I'll be glad
together, and I think that makes sense. But to Representative Clark, I mean, certainly it's a lot of data in 30 days, so maybe there's a place in there we could work, or even as the governor started this year with the ZBB of doing it with a few departments. Perhaps you take the departments that had the largest expenditures, and we specifically talk about them year one to work the kinks out of the process, and then we come back and do it forward. So
yes, sir. I'll be glad to do that.
Anything, but to try to, if you will, crawl before we walk and walk before we run. I think that would be good. And I know your department does a tremendous job.
Well, thank you, sir.
I think people a lot of times overlook it. We get those reports, and I wish people would spend more time with them. We have a couple in our folder. You guys do a good job, and if you could work with the representative, perhaps we can work on putting that together.
Yes, sir.
Did the committee have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
I wondered why it didn't go to the OPB, since they really would need all this information to start. The governor really sets the budget for us to start working on. If maybe OPB would be a place to do this instead of the audits. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, they are.
They're the budget. They really set the budget.
Yes, sir. As far as the prospective information, now the back look with regard to the funds that were received by the agencies. In fact, we audit that every year, and we would be able to provide audited data, but a little bit later on in the year. That's shown in our statewide single audit, and I'd be glad to work with the state accounting office to be able to get that information in a format. But we don't really work with budgets, and the information, once it was if it were collected and compiled by the Office of Planning and Budget, the information passing through our hands, I don't believe would add any more assurance on the data, because we wouldn't be able to pass judgment on its validity. So
I understand. I think what the chair lady says makes sense. I think what the representative is trying to get to, and I'll let him come back if I mischaracterize this, is there exists a situation where our budget may be $18 to $20 million one time in the state. Another $25 million, I believe. I'm sorry, I'm saying million. It's billion. Mm-hmm. Another $25 billion comes from the federal government for various programs, including Medicaid and a variety of things. I think what the gentleman is trying to get at here is, should those federal funds go away, we as a state need to be prepared what gets done. That, there may
Absolutely.
be those that advocate things that are being paid for by the federal government still need to get done, so we have to find state dollars to do that. In which case, what state programs? That just needs to be looked at. The contingency.
Yes, sir. I don't doubt that at all.
So I think the one thing I would add to the gentleman is when he says in the aggregate value of the state receipts, the aggregate value of what's appropriated by the legislature, but also maybe what specific programs. I mean, we see those if you look at the new things coming into our budget, but until we go zero base, we don't exactly see what federal dollar pays for what program out there in DCH.
Right.
We just see so that there are federal funds that flow in there and things get done. People don't in many cases realize if it's a state dollar paying for it or a federal dollar. And in fact, we have had people bring us budget cuts when I was vice chair of appropriations, and they thought they were saving a lot of state dollars, and really, in fact, what they were doing was cutting a program that was, for the most part, federally funded and saving no state dollars. So, in fact, by not doing that, we actually lost money as a state. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I think the types of things to which I'm referring. So, I think the gentleman brings us a good proposition, and if you would work with him, I think some members of the committee have expressed an interest to get with him, and we'd look forward to continued work.
Yeah.
Perfect. Do we have other speakers?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Tom Gale. I'm with the Georgia Municipal Association, and I too commend Representative Clark for bringing this measure. If I was a state policymaker like you all are, I'd want to know as much information as I could about how other outside dollars could affect the state's budget. I have a concern about line 77, the part that does take into account city and county budgets. While I would argue, of course, that at the local government level, we're more like speedboats than cruise ships, and also we're not supplemented by federal dollars to the extent that the state certainly is. And so we have reporting requirements now. We have to send information about our budgets to the Carl Vinson Institute of Government's tax expenditure database up in Athens. We have to submit budget information to DCA every year. We have to do annual audits that we send to Russell's office. And all of this information is very useful at the local level, but it's useful to, in my estimation, not as much to state policymakers as to the taxpayers in those particular communities and the folks who set policy in those particular communities, which are the mayors and city councilmen who are elected to serve and be the fiduciary agents of the money that comes into that particular city. So I would just suggest that the committee and Representative Clark consider doing a study, but making that study limited to the state institutions of higher education, the things that y'all have fiduciary responsibility for, and you let our mayors and council members and taxpayers, the ultimate accountability, make a decision about how these federal funds could impact the city budget. And I'll be glad to try to answer any questions.
If you would, we know who you are, but for those that don't,
Tom Gale, and I'm with the Georgia Municipal Association.
Thank you, Tom. I knew it. Would you take a question from?
Sure, I'd be glad to try to answer.
Anyone have any question? I would only offer this and ask you to get with the representative. I think he is, we are certainly not trying to macromanage our cities and counties, or I don't believe the representative is. But I would ask you to think about this, get back with your board, and ask them what happens if federal dollars dry up to the state. One might assume state dollars would dry up to the city. So I think all he would be looking at here is cities and counties need to look at and find out what happens if LARP goes away. Just something that we all know about. What happens if other things go away? Because I've sat in that seat, and I know in many cases, I won't say many cases, in some cases, cities and counties are spending money on X because the state's paying for Y. If one day Y quit getting paid for, they're going to have to make a decision between X and Y. And I think all the gentleman is looking for is, should they not be asked to, wouldn't it be wise for you and your taxpayers to prepare this report? So perhaps it would be something, if that study is done and we think this is a good idea, maybe we would communicate down to the cities and counties, we think this is a good idea, but if you just send a letter to the Department of Community Affairs or the state institute, whatever. If you send a letter back up here and say, we heard you, you warned us, but we choose not to, that would be sufficient to me. But I think what he would seek to do, and again, I'll let the representative articulate further, but I think what he seeks to do here is there may be a day coming where money from above, whether it be the feds to the state or the state to the municipalities, is decreased substantially. We would like to encourage you on behalf of all our common taxpayers to take a look. If the mayor writes a letter and says, thanks, we're in good shape, that's good enough for me. It's just something to think about.
And I appreciate those comments. You yourself, as a former mayor, understands that those decisions sometimes are going to have to happen when funding sources from outside take place. There's, Representative Hill and Representative Epps have sat in those local government shoes as well, and these kind of concerns are our city officials probably have nightmares about this kind of situation occurring, and it's happened in recent years at the state level. It's happened probably in recent years at the federal level, but I can guarantee you they're thinking about this and making contingencies. I guess the question we would have is whether they have to start doing this. The bill calls for a study of whether or not we should do all this paperwork and survey and reporting for these type of contingencies. And I would just suggest that it's important for them to think about that at the local level, but keep those decisions and those concerns at the local level. But I will definitely talk with Representative Clark. I did get a chance to talk with him before the committee meeting, so be glad to continue to work with him.
Very well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Any further comments on House Bill 669? Any further speakers on 669? Representative Clark, would you like to wind up, or would you like to have any?
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I will heed your sound advice and speak with the gentlemen who have just spoken, and we'll hear any further advice or feedback they may have, and appreciate another chance to present this before the committee. If
I could, if folks are interested in working with the representative, I would ask you to do that at the end of this week, and I know Monday is a holiday, but prior to Tuesday afternoon, we'll try to meet again on Tuesday afternoon and perhaps be in a posture to move his measure forward. So please get with him. You have Thursday, Friday. And, they have the weekend. Representative Clark's a hard-working man. He'll get with you over the weekend. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And let me ask, the chair's got some, I will be required to be out of town some this weekend, so I'm going to ask if you would to work with Representative Williamson with the committee, if you need to work direct with the committee, and if anyone else is interested, but he would be the person to work with us.
It would be my privilege. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Chairman Martin. And you're going to present House Bill 920? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Chokas. I'd just like to thank the committee and ask your indulgence. I, too, would ask the committee to take this bill under advisement this afternoon. Ask anyone on the committee or anyone in the audience that would like to work to perfect the legislation to work with me, and then request that we would hear this again next week in hopes of moving it forward. Very simple proposition. Just call your attention to line 16 through 21, and since it is such a short measure, I'm just going to read it to the committee. What we're asking to be put in the language is that the tax expenditure review this is what this section is talking about, a tax expenditure review. So we're adding some requirements that the review may include a description of the objective of the tax expenditure, an analysis of whether the tax expenditure is meeting the objective, an analysis of the tax expenditure's effect on the distribution of the tax burden and administration of the tax system, and to the extent possible, the analysis of the persons, corporations, or entities that are being benefited. Basically, when the state passes a tax expenditure, which could be a tax credit or an exemption from some indirect tax in the state of Georgia, we have legislation in place that talks about a tax expenditure review. What we seek to do here is put language in that would further define some additional objectives for that review, such that the state could look back and find out, for instance, if not charging sales tax on this podium, if bought in the month of January, really did benefit the state economically, or if giving a jobs tax credit that had been in place for a number of years, after that had been in place, that we look back and said, when we gave those credits, those jobs were created in that area, and therefore the economy picked up and other taxes were had, because the idea of our tax credits and our tax incentives and exemptions are to promote an economic benefit such that it ultimately grows the tax base. And that is, I think, the third item, is its effect on the tax burden. Is just taking a tax exemption and putting that in place, in fact, just making the tax burden on a smaller group of taxable items. Does that put more stress on those? So we just seek to look for reports so that would come back and we could have some analysis. The reason I am not prepared to move the legislation forward at this time is at one point we had asked actually for the Department of Audits or the Office of Planning and Budget to make a recommendation after compiling this information. With due respect to both of them, the legislature, in my opinion, is the policy making, working with the executive branch, but we're the policy making body. We should take the information compiled by them and in some manner that would pass legislative muster. We should form a committee in this House. By the Speaker's appointment, it could be a combination of members of Appropriations, this committee, and Ways and Means to review this data and make recommendations as to which tax expenditures need to continue, perhaps be increased, and in other cases, which tax expenditures are not being effective and therefore need to be reviewed for possible repeal.
Thank you, Chairman Martin. Are there any questions from the committee? And so you want to continue with the process and just looking for a hearing, is that correct?
Yes, sir. I mean, to be perfectly honest, we have not yet completed our discussions with leadership, the Speaker's office particularly, and how we might define the body of legislators that would review this data and perhaps make recommendations. But because just creating it and throwing it out there without someone to look at it and make a recommendation, it only gets us partway there. So we're in discussions with the Speaker's office to try to find the right group of people to not overburden one particular committee or the other, but to bring forward, it matters in Ways and Means. They write the tax writing policy. It, of course, matters to Appropriations. As we all know, this committee was created to try to help look after both ends of that, work with the respective chairmen of Appropriations and Ways and Means. So we want to look to the Speaker to communicate to us how best he would see the membership and the makeup of this committee, and it may well be something where it would be the chairs of several committees or their designee and some ad hoc. Certainly, to be clear from my standpoint, and of course the Speaker appoints folks in the House, but from my standpoint, I think I could almost speak for Speaker Ralston that we do definitely want to make sure in the legislation that we articulate that we want people from all parties involved. This would not be a majority party that one might think if we're taking chairman of committees. I would certainly hope that we would involve the minority party and the majority party and members from around the state to make these determinations.
Perfect. Well, you've got a question, number 25.
Thank you. Representative, did we have a bill like this several years ago? I seen this bill before?
I think probably what you're referring to is the bill that actually put this original language in place, the tax expenditure review process in place, and what we're looking to do.
Don't we have a bill like? I mean,
Well,
what,
we have. If you look, if you actually look, the code section that we're modifying, 451275, we put in place several years ago.
Okay.
What this language does is it seeks to beef it up a little bit. Quite frankly, it seeks. Okay, we do some of this. There is that process for a tax expenditure review. We're looking for it to do some specific things, some actionable data on which legislators can make decisions and recommendations. Because again, we could get actionable data. A committee could come forward with legislation. It still has to pass the House and Senate and be signed by the governor before it would become law. But at this process, we're just trying to look at this data that's out there and could be collected. And you bring up a good point, because I have talked with Revenue. I've talked with folks about doing this. Their worry with doing this in the past was before they went to a newer system. They have a system in place that going forward, they're much more able to track these expenditures, tax expenditures, on a exemption by exemption, credit by credit basis than they were in the past. So as long as we don't ask them to go from 2012 back to 2008, that would be problematic. But if we ask them to collect the data going forward to give us information on which to base decisions, they would be able to do that. And there may be somebody from those various departments here that can speak to that further.
a follow-up question. Are we using that data we've collected? And I think there's several bills pending. Are we going back and looking at the data collected before we go forward with these other bills?
And there may be people that can talk about that in a little more detail. I don't think there's this kind of specific data being prepared at the level we are looking for. I think that's what we're trying to do at this point, for the very reason they could not look back with the previous system.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Well, super. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you bringing that to our attention. I'm sorry? Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. Are there any speakers on this legislation? Tom?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Tom Gale again with GMA. We, too, support Representative Martin's proposal here. It just makes sense to the state to understand whether these types of tax expenditures are, to use the expression, providing the bang for the buck for the state and its communities. And local governments, of course, are partners with the state, and things that affect the state's ability to provide services and quality of life and infrastructure and you name it can affect all our cities across the state. So we commend the chairman and would endorse the concept as well.
Super. Any questions
Thanks,
for
Mr.
Tom?
Chairman.
No. Is anyone there from audits? I saw Russell Hinton earlier. Is anyone there from, would someone like to speak from that perspective? Ma'am, would you like to speak?
Yes, but I'm not from audits.
Okay.
Hi. Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, and thank you, Representative Martin, for this bill, HB 920. My name is Pamela Perkins-Carn, and I am the co-chair of 2020 Georgia, which is a broad coalition of nonprofits and community leaders across Georgia, 80 in total, and growing. And we are here to lend our support to this bill and to Representative Martin, HB 920. We do see it as a tool that will allow us to assess how we are using our taxpayer dollars, whether the investments we're making are working and growing Georgia in an economic positive direction. And again, so we just want to say we're supportive of the leadership. Thank you for your consideration, and thank you for giving us this opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Are there any questions? All right. Nope. No questions. All right. Well, thank you very much. At this time, Chuck, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, members of the committee. We had one additional piece of legislation that we were thinking about adding to our agenda due to the late hour, since we were pushed by the session going late, and we're now working toward a 4 o'clock meeting. I'm going to hold that over. We'll meet at least Tuesday if there is a sense of urgency on this movement on this legislation, which there may be. Look, I'd ask the committee members to be vigilant and look. There may be a call for a meeting tomorrow after session to review another piece of legislation. But at this point, the chair's intention is to meet next Tuesday to have the second hearing, and if we're in the posture to move forward with the two measures that we heard this afternoon. Is there any questions or comments relative to good of the order for the committee? If not, we'll stand adjourned without objection. Without objection, we'll adjourn.